In place, 10 minutes walk. I guess you lost the chance for today. So my name is Elif. I'm going to be the moderator of this session. And I have the pleasure to introduce you Bruno, who worked at Amazon some years. And then you did your PhD while working, but while working at Amazon or before? Look at that. Get inspired if you are thinking about doing PhD and if you haven't done it yet. And then he founded his company with another co-founder. We will hear about that also, I guess, right? So enjoy your talk and bitteschön.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining the session. Hope you had a good lunch. I didn't have ice cream either. So biologit is building AI solutions for the drug safety industry. And today I want to talk a little bit about putting ML in production in a regulated industry with the additional constraints of being a young startup and what we observed and what we learned along the way. So just to give an intro to pharmacovigilance, this is a discipline that concerns the detection and prevention of adverse drug reactions. It's a really, really big deal. Here's some recent numbers. Just for the EU, just short of 200,000 deaths a year can be attributed to adverse drug reactions. So, so governments around the world pay close attention to this. They pay close attention to this, and they mandate pharma companies to do something about it. The framework that exists here in the European Union and in many other jurisdictions is there's a regulatory authority, in the case here the EMA, that provides oversight over this activity, and also the guidelines, how they expect these processes to be carried out by pharma companies. Ultimately, they also have legal authority to take action. If they think a drug is unsafe, they can pull it out of the market, for example. And they also have the authority to go and audit a pharma company to make sure they're doing things the way they expect it to. And this issue on auditing is also important for us, vendors of technology solutions in this space, because audit requirements sort of cascade down to vendors as well. Nobody's off the hook. And this will become important because of the issue on guidelines on AI. If we drill down a little bit on this process, I'm looking at the data collection and assessment parts here. This sort of looks like a data pipeline. There's all these inputs on the left here. This can be spontaneous reports. If I take a medication and don't feel well, I can pick up the phone and call a hotline and report the event. Same thing can happen from hospitals. And also same thing can happen in the scientific literature, which is the area where we are more active now. So all this data goes in and undergoes lots and lots of layers of assessment and review until some action can be taken. We're working on the scientific literature, and I have here an example. It's a bit of a historical document now. Many people heard of the thalidomide events back in the 50s and 60s. And this is a letter from a doctor to a journal, and I believe the first mention of the event. So that's why scientific literature is important. Those events do get reported there. And this job is mandatory for pharma companies that have drugs on the market to this day. Drilling down yet again, this is sort of an outline of scientific literature monitoring for pharmacovigilance. There are, again, lots of steps there. People go on the likes of Embase and PubMed, search for the products, and then make lots and lots of assessments. It's a laborious process, and the chart here indicates that the volume of scientific publication just keeps on growing. There are scary charts like this for pretty much every pharmacovigilance activity. So it's laborious, it's time-consuming, the volume is growing. The industry should be, heavily motivated to seek solutions, especially using machine learning. Because there's certainly a lot that we can do here, right? However, this chart here, I'll try and move out of the way. This chart here is from a recent survey that just came out this year by this industry group called Traceability. The rows are steps on one of those pharmacovigilance processes. The columns are technology. And I singled out the ones that we here care about. So we have machine learning, NLP, NLG. And in this chart, red is better. Red means there's more investment, more activity on productionizing use cases that involve these certain technologies. So if red is better, the picture doesn't look great for us compared to things like RPA. We're not winning. So what's going on here? Everybody's convinced, and by the way, if you go on industry conferences in pharmacovigilance, everybody talks about AI all the time. They're really, really interested. And so everybody sees the benefit. So what's going on here? And from the same survey, one of the top reasons is to do with regulatory compliance. And we'll dive into why is that. And it's not that there isn't compliance guidance coming out. There is from regulators around the world. But people worry in this industry a lot about not doing things the right way, and because that has consequences. And especially if you're not, let's say, if you're not one of the top pharmas around the world, you have limited budgets to invest in innovation and those things. You might shy away from deciding to implement ML if guidance is unclear, for example. So I picked a few examples of what guidance exists today. This one came from the FDA back in 2019. It has lots of interesting points, but I decided to show this chart here, which shows two interesting things. One is, you may recognize this cycle here. It's all about MLOps. There are certainly good practices that you must have when building your models and putting together training data and so on. But then everything else that happens after that also needs oversight. And another point here is what they say there on number one, culture of quality and organizational excellence. When it comes to regulators, they like to look at the company and how the company operates. So it's not just about the model, and it's not even just about the entire product, it's about the company and what kind of culture does the company have. So all this goes under scrutiny. Then some time passed, and the FDA got together with Health Canada and the MHRA, which is the UK regulator, and they put out this paper called Good Machine Learning Practices. The wording here is medical devices, but this tends to be more broadly adopted. And this is good. It's a short document. There's only a couple of pages long. But it touches on some interesting things. But you can see here something similar to what I think Rasmus' talk discussed yesterday. For example, point number 2, good software engineering practices must be adopted. That's great. What is a good software engineering practice? How do I know my engineering practice is good or bad? That's totally undefined in this document. So it carries some ambiguity here, and it's open to interpretation. But at least it helps focus the minds on what are the things that the regulatory authorities are going to care about. And then the last one I wanted to mention is not coming from regulators as such. It comes from this industry group called Traceability. Their members are large pharma companies by and large, so their opinion carries some weight. And the good thing about this paper is that it takes as a starting point this methodology called GAMP. I don't know if anyone heard of GAMP before. I certainly haven't before. Start working in this industry, but it's very widespread. Everybody understands GAMP, and so it puts the question of implementing AI in a terminology that everybody in the industry already understands. So that in itself is very positive. And there's a couple of interesting things on the GAMP framework that I think are very useful for MLOps in general and for AI systems in high-stakes use cases. The first one is this idea that all your decisions need to be totally documented. So how you do things needs to be explicit and documented. And there also needs to be documented evidence that you are in fact performing the steps that you say you are. So that's thing number one. And then thing number two is to do with validation, which is essentially testing at all possible levels, from the codes all the way up to user requirements. Okay, and yet this is another report from an umbrella group that where all the regulators discuss emergent topics. And they kind of bluntly states that more regulation is needed, so they recognize that the level of detail is probably not going to be enough. So more is coming. That certainly is not stopping companies from implementing systems in this space. And we're a startup in this space, so we don't want to stop either. So how do we make progress? What we did was we looked at all the guidance that exists today and aggregated it in a sensible way. Went ahead and implemented and provided the justification for why we did things the way we did. And then we put this back out in the world. So there's a paper, this paper that we wrote that discusses what was our approach and what sort of decisions we made and how we interpreted the more ambiguous bits. So this is open for feedback, for scrutiny, and hopefully we'll evolve this discussion. Because in general, we also observed that there is a gap from the high-level guidance to where the rubber meets the road. How do we get there? And we thought it would be really useful when we were starting this, wouldn't it be great if we had at least one case study to point to and say, this is how these people did it. So we couldn't find one, but so we put ours out there. And when we started looking at all this guidance, we see there's some common themes appearing. Traceability, which I already mentioned, this idea of total product lifecycle, which is all to do with MLOps, and this idea of AI development being a multidisciplinary effort. So to get started, what we did was we compiled all the regulatory guidance that existed at the time and reframed the problem into risks and risk controls. And it turns out you can group a lot of the guidance because, as you can expect, they touch upon same topics quite often. So this table is from the paper, and we listed what were the risks, from where we identified these risks, and in our own system, what are the things that we're doing to prevent or mitigate the risk. And unsurprisingly, this touches upon everything, from the ML design to the user experience, and very much on the documentation side as well. So a few examples of what we did in terms of traceability of decisions. We invested heavily on having our processes written down. And for this idea of traceability, we do this a lot on code. We send a pull request, someone reviews it, the code is approved, and we translated the same idea for our documentation. This is a big effort if you're coming from, like most technology teams, from a culture of agile and people over processes and all those things. It's not something to be neglected. Trying to write this all up at the very end of the implementation is not going to work. And those things really need to be living documents that your organization understands and executes. The good thing about this is that it makes it easier to go from the internal documentation to the public one. So we do quite a bit of that. For example, the paper that I mentioned, and also the model fact sheets, which I'll touch on in a second. In terms of multidisciplinary efforts, it's kind of a fuzzy term, and what that means exactly for us is we had pharmacovigilance specialists working together pretty much from day one. And I can tell you, if it was just a data science team and someone came up with the requirements, could you build a predictor for adverse events on text. Sure, we'll go and do it. It would certainly be very different from what we arrived at with the help of the specialists, because this problem is a lot more nuanced than we think. And of course, there's this asymmetric risk profile here. We don't want to hide away, let's say, an article that has a potential safety event. That's much, much worse than showing a false positive, because false positive is just a little bit of extra work. I won't say too much about this one, just to say that this idea of risk controls, of course, feeds into the technical work as well. We have lots of guardrails on our inference pipeline to prevent the models from doing things we don't want it to do. And the same thing on the UI. We present things in a way that users have total control over the level of supervision. Nothing ever gets hidden away, and everything is fully traceable as well. We really double down in this idea of documentation as a way of mitigating risk. And this is where what the regulatory guidance is saying overlaps quite a lot with the work of transparent AI and the stuff that's coming from our world, because it really helps prevent the risk of misuse of your model. You can think of it that way. So we put out a fact sheet, which is heavily inspired by the fact sheets that IBM put out, and also by the work of the partnership of AI called About ML. It's really, really interesting. I recommend check it out. So yeah, in the fact sheet, it discusses all the technical details one might expect, how the model is put together, what the data set looks like, what are the performance metrics that we care about, and also it discusses the business problem and the intended use. This is what this model does, and it doesn't do all these other things. So that's also public, and it's going to be released with every model release. So that's great. We did all these documents, and we're done, right? And no, it turns out we're not done. We engaged with the partnership of AI. I don't know if anybody knows of them. It's definitely worth checking them out. I found them through the guild. They were at one point on the Slack channel. And we worked with them on a series of workshops to really understand the impacts of documentation that we were producing. This was great for us. We did well on some things, so this is a longitudinal survey over the weeks that we had workshops with them. So we're doing well on a few things and not so well on other things. This issue with audience, as we started digging into, really is to do with the whole question of adoption, which is quite interesting for us. As a user, how do I adopt machine learning technology in the safest possible way? It has something to do with fact sheets and so on, but for a non-technical audience, you have to go a lot further than that. And maybe even provides a blueprint of what it means to use an AI-based system that's making predictions on your behalf. How do you think about levels of supervision and so on? So we're thinking about this problem a lot, and we're spending some time in refining our documents to that effect. Right. I guess in terms of lessons learned, I mentioned documentation quite a bit. I'll finish up with one point on how pharmacovigilance works and what can we learn from them. So this is an industry that cares a lot about being safe and not making mistakes. And for example, they have this role of a qualified person. And a qualified person is an individual hired by a pharma company, but personally responsible for the oversight of a drug. What that means is that if something goes wrong and that person is at fault, they go to jail. The worst case scenario, right? And so that person, that individual is heavily motivated to do the right thing, irrespective of where the paycheck comes from. That's a really interesting idea. And when you think about AI steering committees, AI ethics committees that large companies are putting up, there's kind of a relation. The same thing with those incident databases that researchers are putting up on AI. Well, that's what pharmacovigilance is, and they've been doing this for a long, long time. So as our industry becomes more regulated, maybe looking at what the pharmacovigilance framework does today is maybe looking into what the future might look like for us. And with that, I thank you all and open for any questions.
Thank you, Bruno. Any questions? We have quite some time. Maybe meanwhile they are thinking about their questions, based on the symbol on your card, you are hiring. What roles are you looking for?
Yes, we're hiring. We're looking for data engineers, machine learning engineers. If you're up for a challenge, come talk to us.
Yeah, think about that too. Now, any questions or comments? I thought.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very valuable insights, especially for me because I'm dealing with quite similar topics, not from the pharmaceutical industry, but from the transportation mobility industry, and there we also have a lot of safety requirements for cars and vehicles, and this is at the moment rather developing, while it seems that your industry is obviously much more developed in the preciseness of the regulations. So I would say for the mobility industry, there's a lot to learn from your side. At least that was my impression from your talk. So yeah, thanks for these insights.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree. I think when it comes to safety frameworks, they're more advanced. That's what they do day in, day out for many, many decades now. I'm sure we can learn something from them.
Any other comments or questions?
I'm sorry. There are a lot of frameworks that are doing it for decades. You're right with this, but they wouldn't say at this very moment, no, AI is not tolerated if it comes to safety. And we need to discuss with them that AI can also being applied to a safety critical application. And this is currently a challenge. And it seems that you have convinced the authorities that an AI can contribute to this positively and can still be managed to be safe.
Yeah. The way people tend to think on pharmacovigilance is to have a risk-based assessment of what to do with the technology. So it's figuring out the level of risk that you're willing to undertake by having AI making predictions and the level of oversight. It's one of the reasons why we don't inside the application, for example, we don't hide any predictions. Everything is there for auditability purposes, and people can go and do the level of quality check that they feel comfortable with according to their risk framework.
Last chance.
Yeah, thank you. Really nice talk. I have a question about risk or risk management. So that appeared on a lot of the slides and seems to be like a central concept you're concerned with, right? So what is risk in AI in your case?
We start from the business requirements and then work back. For us, one very important risk is predicting something as not an adverse event, whereas in fact it is. And so the system needs to be designed to go to great lengths to mitigate this risk as much as possible. And so we do things on the technical side, we do things on the documentation side, and also on the user side to make sure that they have a say on this. That goes back to the level of supervision. That answered your question. We do, but it will depend on, just speaking a little bit more about our use case. We built a model that detects whether some article is discussing a possible safety event, which is drug agnostic, but the level of risk will be drug dependent. So in other words, there is a step on the adoption of the tool that, that this assessment needs to be carried out, right? What is the model doing with respect to your specific drug? And that's where this information will come from. The quantitative information will come from there.
More questions? Then thank you very much for the insights you provided. One more, or the first time. Applause, please.